Denny, Conn, and Drew Beechum. Man, it's great to have you guys on the show today. And I just wanted to welcome you both, and thanks everybody else for joining today. Now, Drew, I know just getting things set up, you've been especially busy. So I want to know what you've had time to brew, or let me rephrase that, what you've made time to brew.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I've been stupid busy. So I did have to carve out a little time because the one tradition I do try and keep up on every year is I've been making a Santa Claus homage, to borrow Denny's term, on a regular basis. And so I made time earlier this year to go and make that. And if people don't know what Santa Claus is, the world's strongest lager at 14.5%, and it's just sort of a weird project.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now, Denny, I know we were exchanging some texts last night, and I saw some really fascinating cooking. But what have you had time to homebrew anything?
Yeah, I did. A couple weeks ago, I brewed a rye doppelbock as a kind of a pilot batch for a beer that I got asked to brew at Cold Fire Brewing here in Eugene. Dan and Stephen Hughes, the owners, asked me and my friend Brant to come and brew with them. Thought it'd be kind of fun. So they came out here and we brewed a pilot batch of the rye doppelbock. And then a few days later was the 26th anniversary of my first brew. So I brewed what I hope will be a West Coast IPA for that.
Well, you guys are shaming me. All I've brewed is a couple of NA beers. Well, let me introduce you guys. Not that you hardly need an introduction, but this is kind of a highlight. So Denny Conn is a seasoned home brewer and esteemed expert on the craft beer world. He brings invaluable insights and expertise to the art of home brewing. And today we're going to be talking about his West Coast IPA. Now, Drew Beechum is a renowned figure in the home brewing community. He shares his wealth and knowledge and passion for crafting exceptional beers like the West Coast IPAs and offers invaluable guidance to home brewing enthusiasts. Well, guys, I think the best place to start is a good recipe, because we're going to be talking about nuances all through it. So could one of you please share what you think is a exceptionally good West Coast IPA?
Yeah. So I'll start this with, well, actually, Denny, why don't you start with our disclaimer about the West Coast IPA?
Well, yeah, we need to make clear that really there are two versions of West Coast IPA. There's the traditional version, which we've all been making for years, and then there's a more modern version. And I think the big differences are that the modern version is lighter, both in body and malt flavor. And the more traditional version, you're going to see probably crystal malt showing up in it and a little bit more mouthfeel and body to it.
Yeah, and so last year for Homebrew Conn in San Diego, Denny and I went and we collaborated with North Park Brewing Company to make the Denny Kong West Coast IPA. There's Denny, there's me. Life is good, right? And it was a great collaboration and a lot of fun to have the discussions, because at one point there was an argument about crystal malt.
Yep.
But this one is for a 5.5 gallon batch that starts around 1065 original gravity at about 65 IBUs. It was basically 88% raw North Star Pils, which is really great, clean base malt. 9% of Vienna malt, which is our one character malt in this. And then optionally either some acid malt to adjust your pH, and also a little bit of dextrose, only about 2% of dextrose, in order to kind of dry out that back end. For the water, we were shooting for a 2-to-1 ratio on sulfate to chloride. And then it was just a simple mash rush of 152 degrees for an hour. And then, because it's a West Coast IPA, this is where it gets tricky. We get into the hops. A simple first wort hopping of Warrior, about 0.67 ounces, and then nothing else in the kettle. That was it for the kettle. And then finally we get into the whirlpool at 170 degrees with 1 3/4 ounces of Cascade Cryo for 30 minutes. And then we used a brand new product that's coming out of YCH called Trial 702. I don't know if they've actually come up with a real name for it yet, but Trial 702 Citra. And we added 1/3 of an ounce of that in kind of a dip hopping fashion before dry hopping with Cascade Cryo for 2 days. And then Mosaic Cryo, Citra Cryo, Simcoe Cryo for another dry hop for 3 days. And all of that was fermented with the Yeast West Coast IPA yeast, which is currently available.
And it was a great beer. I was in that session. I enjoyed it.
Yeah,
we were really pleased with how that turned out,
and it hit all the notes that we wanted. It was dry, it was crisp, it had a very full bitterness to it, without making you feel like your teeth were about to fall out, without also being boring.
I was going to fill in for AHA members. They can replay the audio portion of that and get the copy of the PDF from your pretty intense presentation with some great questions.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, if you weren't writing down that recipe Drew gave, it's all on our website, experimentalbrew.com. So you can go there and grab it.
Perfect. Well, Drew, as a seasoned home brewer, what do you believe sets the West Coast IPA apart from other beer styles? And why is it suddenly so captivating?
Well, okay, so let's hit that first part, or that last part first. I think it's suddenly so captivating because it's a sort of return. For those of us who've been around craft beer for a while, we remembered the IBU wars of the early 2000s. And then hazies came. And I think what ended up happening, or what is happening right now, is that the West Coast IPA is taking lessons from the hazy IPA, in terms of aroma presentation, sort of layering of aromas and flavor, but it's returning it back into a package that's far more drinkable. Because to me, the thing about West Coast IPA is, again, crisp, it's bitter, it gets off the tongue in a way that it encourages you into that next step, or that next sip, but at the same time doesn't make you feel full and sort of mouth coated like a hazy IPA can.
Yeah, and I think there's a real simple explanation in there too, that it's just a reaction to all the hazy IPAs. And I also think that once it starts, then it snowballs and becomes a trend, just like hazy IPAs became a trend, right? So the pendulum swung from, clear, bitter IPAs over to hazy IPAs. People drink those for a while. It's like, I'm tired. I want something new and different. So the pendulum swings back. It's your fickle beer drinkers chasing the new and different.
Does it boil down to the drinkability, I guess, of more than one pint of a hazy versus a West Coast?
Oh yeah,
it certainly does for me. Even a traditional West Coast versus this new style West Coast. They really, the new style of West Coast IPA really takes a cue from Belgian beers in that they are what Stan Hieronymus called digestible. Right? They're easy to drink. They have a light body to them. As a matter of fact, most modern West Coast IPAs even have a touch of sugar in them to enhance that drinkability and lighten the body even more. Denny uses 5% sugar, and that, along with the Pilsner and Vienna base, makes a beer that is almost dangerously drinkable.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence, at least out here on the West Coast, a lot of breweries that you go into nowadays, it feels like about half the menu is, IPA, which, people can either love or hate. But out here, at least, the other half is lagers,
Yeah.
And I don't think that's strange. They're sort of playing in the same space.
Well, let's talk about the hop blends. So Drew, you went through a pretty intense list of hops and how they were added, and cryo versus some that aren't even released yet. So what are key considerations or your tips for a home brewer that wants to try and brew a stellar West Coast IPA?
My primary tip is the same one I will give everybody about anything dealing with beer, which is to be mindful and to be focused. Way too often as home brewers and even professional brewers, we have a tendency to sort of go and raid the shelves and go, ooh, that looks fun. Let's go add this. And particularly nowadays when we got all these new malt varieties being released, all these new hop varieties being released, like I literally just talked with a guy about a brand new hop out of Idaho 568 or something pink. And I was like, what is this? And so we have a real tendency to sort of, just like with the beer drinking, be attracted to the new things because we want to learn something, right? And so brewers tend to just go, I'm going to grab this, I'm going to grab this, I'm going to grab this, and throw it all in the kettle without thinking too much about it. So my big tip to everybody is to go be mindful when you choose your hops and when you choose your malts. Think about what it is those flavors are. Don't just kind of willy-nilly grab everything that's on the shelf. And so, yeah, you're right. The Denny recipe had a lot of different hop varieties in it and a lot of different form factors. But you'll notice that those are all very classical West Coast-ish hops, with Citra and Simcoe and Cascade, and then, just a little bit of that mosaic for something new. But they all play along that same spectrum. And so you get something that feels unified. The problem is now with a lot of the hops that particularly are like very pineapple and guava and mango, these very tropical flavors, people will pair those up against hops that are very sort of citrus dank, and they don't always work together very well. So again, be mindful.
Yeah, not always, but sometimes they do. But yeah, basically what Drew's saying is what I always say about recipe design. Try and taste it in your head and know why every single ingredient is going in there, right? Imagine what that will do. Just don't put it in there. The other thing about the Denny recipe is you'll see the same varieties of hops repeated at different points during the brewing's process. Maybe knockout hops are the same as the dry hops or something like that. So that really kind of helps keep it focused.
Yeah, and I think and I think it's important to say, don't get lost or hung up on just the idea of simplicity, because you do need a little bit of variation in your hop blend, I think.
Yeah. This, unlike a smash beer, a West Coast IPA, to get that depth of flavor, really needs to have layers in there.
So, Denny, are malts a factor in this to really get a good West Coast IPA?
Very, very much so. I mean, you don't want the beer to be one-dimensional. And in either direction, you don't want it to be malt dominated or you don't want it to be hop dominated. You want them to support each other. And balance is a very cliched word in the beer world. We used to ban brewers from using it when we asked them to describe their style of brewing. But what you want to do is you want to have a malt body in there. When I started brewing, it was always referred to as the malt backbone to support the hops. And unlike when I started brewing, that malt backbone doesn't come from a heavy dose of crystal malt or something like that. It comes from using lighter malts, but flavorful malts. That's why we went with the raw North Star pills on this one. It's a very, very flavorful malt that can stand up to a heavy hopping load. And you throw a little bit of Vienna on top of that to add depth to the flavor, and you've got something that will stand up to all those hops you're going to be throwing in down the road.
And by the way, that's actually one of those huge changes between the modern West Coast IPA and the old school West Coast IPA, using that Vienna as your character malt as opposed to using, say, a Crystal 60.
Yeah. Which was, IPA recipe malts used to be 90% two-row pale malt and 10% Crystal 60. I would knock out IPA after IPA like that and then just change the hops. And that is still a valid approach if you want a traditional classic West Coast IPA. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about the modern contemporary West Coast IPA. And, like I said, drinkability is the real key here.
So, if I can't get those same flavorful malts, what would I look for when I'm trying to get those malts?
I would say, especially for the Pilsner malt, there are Pilsner malts that have a lot of malt flavor to them, or maybe like a sweet flavor. And there are some that are very, very neutral. There are a few that I detect as kind of like grassy or maybe have a hay quality to them. Probably I would avoid those and go for the ones that are sweeter and fuller tasting, because you're going to be loading the hops in there. So you want to start with a base malt that has a discernible flavor of its own. So experiment, taste. Maybe this is the place for smash beers, so you can get to experience the flavors of a variety of different malts. Make yourself a smash pills or a triple or something like that with a Pilsner malt that you're considering for a West Coast IPA, and then get a good idea of the flavor. And that is exactly what I did and how we ended up with the raw North Star pills.
But you're saying avoid a neutral one.
I would say yes, because if you have a neutral malt there, then the beer is going to be all about the hops, right? And you need to have a malt that's going to be as flavorful as your hops are.
Yeah, it's a real trick. You're trying to avoid something that's too insipid and gets into a very sort of blasé back end that doesn't provide you anything, versus something that has too much sugar or too much other character to it. I do think one of the malts that we played around with recently was the Chevalier malt from Crisp, which was they've been billing it as the original IPA malt because it was, and that's almost too characterful for a modern West Coast IPA. But boy, is it an interesting malt.
It's delicious.
So if you had some of that, would you use a little less or avoid it?
I would use less and maybe cut it with some Pils malt.
Yeah, exactly. I would think doing something like a 50-50 blend would probably be about on target for that modern West Coast IPA. I do.
Yeah.
Well, that's some good perspective.
I'm also the weirdo who takes the original IPA malt and makes a mild with it. So,
well,
it's okay.
Drew, you used some of the same words that Sam Calagione used. I was talking to him recently, and I didn't have the guts to ask for clarification when I talked to him, so I'm going to ask you guys. Sam said he thought...
If we can clarify what Sam said.
That's right. That's right. So Sam Calagione recently told me that, and I'm going to read this, that achieving the ideal balance between hop bitterness and flavorful bliss is crucial to crafting a standout West Coast IPA. So how do you do that?
First, be an English major so you can follow what he's saying. If I remember correctly, that was Sam's background. But yeah, how do you do it? Well, I think the biggest thing is that it's what we no longer do, which is, again, I referenced it earlier, the IBU wars, right? I think the real trick is the American brewers used to sort of lay in the hops with a large sense of we're going to get all the IBUs out there, kind of like the hottest hot sauce thing. Because once you start doing that, yeah, you lose any sort of bliss. It just becomes sort of painful torture for your tongue and teeth. So to me, I think what I would take away from Sam's comment is what a lot of brewers would pretty much put as focus on the oils, focus on the aroma and flavor. So a lot of late additions, a lot of playing around with techniques like cool pooling, try and emphasize not the bitter, but the other organoleptic sensations.
Organoleptics?
Organoleptic.
Okay.
It's a fancy way of saying flavor and aroma.
Whoa, and you were talking about Sam.
Yeah, how about that?
Drew, Denny
takes great joy in making people pull out a dictionary.
Yeah. What was left out in that comment, Drew? Denny, what did he miss?
I think that it was as well said as something that vague can be. Uh, I just think that you just have to be conscious the whole time of the way your ingredients are going to work together, and that the key is working together and not just putting in a whomping pile of something that's going to kill everything else.
I mean, it's one of those things where, from a flavor perspective, it's kind of hard to describe, but you know when you got it. It's kind of like when you take that perfect shot of a batting cage or off a tee in a golf course. You know, like you have that perfect swing, and you just feel it the second it happens. You're like, I have hit it, and you know what that is, and it is, to Denny's point, like everything working in concert. I mean, how many times have you gone into a brewery and had a pint of beer where your very first thought on that beer is like, this feels harmonious. This feels like a glass of beer. I mean, like this is something like I can just drink. A lot of times when you have that beer experiences, even in very good places, things can be discordant in a way when you're taking a sip of that pint. And so to me, I think the closest that you can get to what I think Sam's trying to say is that perfect swing of a baseball bat when you just hit the ball just right. And that same thing with a glass of beer when you just pick it up and you go, oh yeah, that's right, beer.
Yeah, I know that for the Denny Con, we made just a lot of guesses about hop additions and stuff like that.
Educated guesses.
Yeah, well, sure, exactly. Definitely educated guesses, but you just don't know if you're guessing right. So when we took that first sip, the first whiff of the aroma, it was like, damn, this turned out just the way it was supposed to.
By the way, it also helps if you have a brewer like Kelsey McNair brewing the beer for you.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. I don't want to say that Drew and I are responsible for all the wonderfulness of that beer. Kelsey was amazing, you know.
Well, Drew, let's. I like it that you segued to having a beer poured, and I can just picture that and tasting it and the aromas. But there's another aspect that's really quite different than what's going on in a lot of other beers right now, and the brilliant clarity is key to a West Coast IPA. It maybe even its defining feature. But, you know, getting a nice bright beer is tough. So what brewing techniques or filtration do you recommend to homebrewers to achieve that level of clarity, especially when we're sort of used to, well, it's hazy, I'll just call it a hazy?
I'll tell you, first things first, for most homebrewers, I would recommend never touching filtration in any real sort of sense of the way. Don't waste your money getting a plate filter or a cartridge filter or anything like that. I think for most homebrewers, that's absolute overkill. For an IPA, I think the real challenge about an IPA is that we do want these relatively fresh if you're focusing on aroma and flavor, because we know those hop characters fade relatively quick. So you can't really use the usual recommendation of, well, just give it time and let it sizzle naturally on its own. That does work, but you're kind of, again, you're playing against each other here in some of your goals. Most important thing I will tell people about making a homebrewed IPA that's nice and clear is choose your yeast wisely. There's a lot of use, even in the professional world, of things like the whole Chico complex, that 1056, US05, 001, that sort of thing. Really great yeast, but it also has some flocculation characteristics that aren't exactly perfect for this sort of goal, which is part of the reason why we use that West Coast IPA yeast from Y Yeast, because that does flocculate really well.
And it's a very crisp yeast also. I noticed that before. I had used that a couple of times before we used it on the Denny Con. So when we were looking for a yeast for that, I suggested that one because it clears really, really well. And it leaves the beer really crisp, which is a key element of that drinkability that we've been talking about.
So choose the right yeast is my first bit of advice. The second bit of advice is figure out how to use biofine or gelatin. The gelatin's very effective. It's very cheap. It's fairly easy to use. And then the other one is, cold is still going to be your friend. Denny and I have both switched to shorter dry hop times. So back when we first started getting brewing, it was like, oh, throw the dry hops in the keg and leave them there until the beer's done, right? Turns out there's problems with that. And so now he and I are both, and a lot of professional brewers too, are more along the time of dry hopping for 48 to 72 hours and using a good strong cold crash to help clear that.
Yeah.
And that impacts clarity?
Good.
Yeah.
It does.
Okay.
You know, because again, you're not allowing long settling times. You're not allowing the hops to kind of get stirred back up by natural convection currents in the keg or in the fermenter. And if you're doing it cold, like we do, the hops pretty much dissolve and then fall pretty quick.
Yeah. And I mean, and we also, I mean, for a West Coast IPA, I would say that cryo hops are pretty much a necessity because you're going to be getting a much cleaner, more focused hop flavor and aroma out of them than you are with traditional T90s. Now, I kind of prefer to use some T90s alongside the cryo, but the cryo makes up the bulk, the majority of my hop charges. And the cryo are in there because the T90s are in there rather because the cryo doesn't have any vegetal matter to provide tannins or anything like that. And just the cryo alone can almost feel a bit hollow or empty. So yeah, you put just a touch of T90 in there to back them up and, you know, maybe like, you know, go 80% cryo, 20% T90. And for my tastes, that gives me exactly what I'm looking for.
Well, and that does fit with the goals of more oil, less jank.
Yeah.
So the cryo actually helps with clarity?
Yeah, because it doesn't have all that vegetal matter there, and it's not releasing polyphenols into your beer like a T90 would.
Okay.
More impact, less veggie.
So,
yeah. And, you know,
use cryo hops. Mm-hmm. Try and keep short, 24, 48 hours for your hopping time?
48 to 72.
No more than 72.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then gelatin's a definite consideration.
Yep. And the right yeast strain.
Most importantly.
I don't do gelatin.
Yep.
Yeah. I just don't do gelatin. Just too much work, too much hassle for me, you know, and I get good clarity from just the cold crashing. The other thing that makes a huge difference is hitting a proper pH in your boil. You know, and you can tell by looking at your kettle if your pH is right. If you're getting this beautiful head of foam on your beer as it's boiling, that is generally a sign that you got your pH right on. And having a perfect pH, or as close as we can get being home brewers, having a good pH is going to be a key to clarity for any kind of beer.
Drew, did I hear, though, that you use gelatin periodically, but Denny does not?
Yep.
What's the difference?
He's afraid of microwaves.
I'm lazier than he is.
Well,
we always have discussions about who's the laziest one, and in this case, I am.
Yeah, but again, this is also one of those things where brewing is a craft where there's 20 different ways to do one thing, and 15 of them are correct. And so you choose which one works best for who you are.
Yeah.
And also it's a difference in goals, right? So Denny is usually serving his beer at home to himself and his wife, maybe to friends who come over to go brew rye doppelbocks. And then a lot of times for me, a lot of my beers I'm taking to club meetings or I'm taking to festival and that sort of thing. So we have some different requirements as well around transportation, for instance. You know, so there's a little bit of difference there too, and that will impact technique.
Next question's for you, Denny. Can you walk me through your personal breakthroughs in crafting West Coast IPAs? What were some key learnings? I think you mentioned something about the no more than 72 hours. You know, what are other key learnings that you've had with brewing such a delicious beer?
I think that we've actually covered quite a few of them.
Well, summarize
proper pH. Okay, here we go. Proper pH, a grist bill that is flavorful but not heavy, using cryo hops to limit the amount of vegetal material and polyphenols that you get into the beer, so that it doesn't become tannic and astringent. Layering the hops in there, using maybe like the same hops but at different points in there, and the yeast, get a yeast that is going to finish crisp and clean and clear. I love Yeast 1056. I love Yeast 1450 for that matter, but I would not eat those. Neither of those would be my first choice for a West Coast IPA, although either one would work okay. But I think that there are better choices.
Drew, what did he leave out?
Two things that I can think of immediately. One is more is not more. So again, not only just in terms of the varieties that you're putting into the beer, but also in terms of the amount that you're putting into the beer. So there was the great study that Tom Shellhammer put out, where we've jokingly referred to as the Shellhammer limit in terms of dry hopping, which you don't want to necessarily overload your kettle or your fermenter with dry hops, because diminishing returns and sometimes actually working at cross purposes. And I forget, Denny, what's 5 grams per liter?
6 grams per liter is what he came up with as the limit over which you'll be extracting tannins and polyphenols. But again, that's another good reason to include cryo in your hop bill.
So that's one. So more is not always more, which I know is sometimes hard for homebrewers to deal with.
Yeah. How many times have I seen a home brewer who said, "Yeah, I used like 3 pounds of dry hops in my beer"?
Oh, I think we've all been there. If you haven't been there, then you're a better person than I am for resisting that urge.
And what you end up with is a harsh, astringent mess.
You end up with soup.
And Doug is raising his hand again.
The other one that I haven't heard us talk about, that I think has actually kind of been a lesson I've learned over the past 4 or 5 years now, is acidification is important. So Denny talked about hitting the proper pH, but a number of really top-notch IPA brewers, people that I really trust and look for their IPAs. So Julian Schrago down at Beechwood Brewing Company, for instance, Vinny at Russian River, they do wort acidification to keep the pH purposely low, because dry hops will raise the pH. They'll push you a little bit more basic. And the problem is that the way the human palate has evolved is the human palate is very, very activated by acidic solutions, because there's part of our brain that thinks something that's acidic is nice and fresh, and therefore it's good for you. And so, just a tiny little bit of lactic acid or citric acid in the post-boil period will keep that pH, drive the pH lower, so that when you dry hop, the pH will come up, but the pH won't come up so far as to get you into, I think the best way to describe it is a pH that tastes flabby.
Ooh, that's the word I had in my mind. That's obviously the right.
Well, and you see,
if we're both thinking that.
It's a tip taken straight from the wine world too. In the wine world, they always acidify the wine, because a pH that's too high, they literally talk about the wine feels flabby. And so in our particular case as brewers, we have a process that's built into the style that raises the pH. We should do something to get around that. And so a little bit of post-wort acidification is actually a real handy little trick.
So there's a lot of aspects with this West Coast IPA that might come across as a little intimidating. Kind of go, oh, it's brilliant clarity, all this perfect balance. What would you say, Drew, to inspire somebody to try if they haven't tried a West Coast IPA in a while, and they realize they've got to work at a little acidification, cryo hops? Maybe they hadn't used cryo hops. They haven't used a particular recommended yeast. How would you inspire them to give it a try anyway?
Don't fear the Reaper. It's only beer.
Yeah, it's only beer. If you are stressing over home brewing, then there is a serious problem, right? It's a damn hobby, people. You're supposed to have fun doing it. Uh, and the best way to do it is go out and get yourself a good West Coast IPA. Sit down with it and drink it or take notes about what it is that you like about it, the aromas, the flavors, the way one flavor fades into another one and then finishes with a third. Sit down and think about that, and then think about how you would recreate it and take a couple shots at it. you know go look at our Denny Conn recipe. Now there's a lot of intimidating stuff in there. I mean, there's one ingredient that is practically unavailable to home brewers, but that doesn't mean you can't use that as a model to start crafting your own version. Try it without the post-boil acidification once and see what happens. If that beer comes out too flabby, then try a little acidification next time to see the difference. Like Drew said, it's only beer. You can always make more.
Yeah. Look, this is so true of so many human endeavors, right? Yeah. We psych ourselves out and we allow ourselves to get intimidated by the fact that we're going to suck at first, almost invariably. But again, this is beer. We all have friends who are just going to be like, it's free beer. Sure. And beer, particularly these days, as long as you're mindful of the idea of vital, healthy, active yeast, you can make beer that is imperfect, but is still perfectly drinkable. So don't get intimidated by all this sort of stuff. Denny's right. Choose a good recipe out there that from a source that you trust, use that as a basis, and go from there, I think.
Yep.
I like that. A beer that's imperfect, but perfectly drinkable.
Yeah. No.
I've
made hundreds of those.
That's the story of my brewing career.
Yeah. Well, guys, this is great. How is the best way to catch your podcast?
Oh, you can get anywhere you can find your podcast: Spotify, Apple, iTunes, Google Play, and you can also always go to www.experimentalbrew.com.
Oh, he's done that before. All right, guys, we got the rapid fire questions coming up. Well, thanks for watching. Your views and comments make this West Coast IPA video possible. And if you found value in any of our videos, please help me out with a like or a comment to fuel our growth, our clout, and attract even more amazing guests.
All right.
You ready?
Okay.
All right, Denny, you've got the first one. What's your recommendation on crystal malts and West Coast IPAs?
For a traditional, yes. For a contemporary, no.
Drew, how would you avoid a one-note flavored IPA and get at least enough complexity to make it drinkable?
2 malts. So a Pilsner Pale and a Vienna or a Munich, depending upon your choice. And then at least 2 varieties of hops. And I would choose something that are kind of in the same family. So something classical citrus, so Cascade and Citra. Kind of keep along the same profile, but just layer them in.
And I would say 3 varieties of hops because, you're going to want something for bittering. Well, of course, yeah. No, one of the things that really differentiates West Coast IPA from, say, New England IPA is a bittering hop addition in West Coast IPA that you often don't have in a New England IPA. And for that, you may want something that's a little bit more intense, like a Columbus or a Chinook, and then pick 2 or 3 other varieties to load up towards the end and for dry hopping and stuff like that to layer the hop flavor and aroma.
So I was asking Sam Calagione, since the 60-minute IPA, I think, is pretty iconic for a West Coast IPA, even though he's on the East Coast. And Sam said a great IPA needs to finish with a bitterness that has a roundness to it. Now, I didn't have the guts to ask Sam that clarification on that either. But Denny, what do you think? Hop bitterness with roundness to it. What does that mean? How do we do that?
To me, that means that you're kind of taking the edge off of it. I guess you could do that with water profile or something like that. And I disagree with him. For me, a good West Coast IPA should slap you in the face with bitterness. But it can't be one-dimensional bitterness. It can't be all about the bitterness, which is why you need that hop bill too. But, there are easily ways you can make a 70 to 75 IBU West Coast IPA with a distinct bitterness without it becoming all about the bitterness.
Although I will say that today's West Coast IPA, the slap across the face, it's less that full straight arm slap and more now just a nice love tap.
Well, yeah, although you remember that in Denny Conn, Kelsey saying that he wished that he had added more bitterness.
Yeah, that was
the
one
audience
I just
agreed,
remembered.
as I remember.
Yep.
Yeah. So don't be afraid of that. It has to have that bitterness to get the sharpness that is going to add to the drinkability along with the light body. But that's the dichotomy kind of. You got to have sharpness, but then you've got to have the malt to kind of like take the edge off that sharpness.
Well, Drew, slap in the face is a good thing about if you overdo thiols. How do you avoid a slap in the face from thiols? Because you can get carried away with them real easy, can't you?
Yeah, and so my first reaction is in modern West Coast IPA, don't. To me, so for people who don't necessarily know what a thiol is a sulfur-bearing compound, and we're used to kind of thinking of those as the things that smell like guavas and passion fruit and mangoes and all those tropical fruit characters, and the problem is, like with any of the thiol sort of boosting elements that are out there, the yeast that have enzymes that will boost thiols or unbound thiols and malt, using things like phantasm powder, using hop blends that are designed powder, using hop blends that are designed to boost thiols, they are a real trick because they will very, very quickly take over the beer. So again, if you do want a strong thiol character in your beer, to avoid overdoing it, my first thing would be try and find hops that will allow you to do it. Layer those in that way.
Yep.
And only then, if you're not getting the thiol character that you want, try the other products, like things like Phantasm. Phantasm has the great advantage of, just like hops, you can layer in how much you want. My one concern about trying to do something with one of these thiol boosting yeast, for instance, is as a brewer, you have very little control over how much thiol it's going to release. So start with your hop blends first, or actually first, don't. Second, start with your hop blends. Third, use a tiny amount of something like Phantasm. And fourth, go make a hazy.
Yeah, right.
If you want
brew something else.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, Denny, best tips on getting the right pH in your IPA.
Pay attention. Know what kind of water you're using. Use a good water program. Drew and I both use Brewing water. I played around with some other ones. I think the Brewing water is probably the best and most accurate out there. That is the place to start. And then taste the beer that you make and decide if maybe some, acidification down the road would have helped it. You can even do this in a glass, right? You make a beer, you think that maybe it's just a little flabby or something. Try putting just the barest drop of lactic acid into your glass and pouring the beer on top of that. See if you think that it improves it any. If so, brew another batch and work on that.
Wow, you didn't mention your well water.
Well, I don't have to because everybody knows about it. Yeah. But I mean, you can start with any water. I happen to be lucky that I have amazing well water, but as long as you know what is in the water you're starting with, That's all that really matters, because then you can compensate for it down the road. Don't go out and buy spring water or something like that. People tend to do that because they think, oh, it's got minerals in it. It's better than reverse osmosis or distilled. It's not, because you don't know what minerals are in there. I saw one recently where somebody said, oh, I bought this spring water. I'm going to use this for brewing. And it listed all the stuff on the side, but the alkalinity was just off the charts. And because this guy didn't know anything about water and what was good in it and what wasn't good in it, he thought, well, I'm getting this spring water with minerals in it, and look, it even tells me what's here. If you're buying water, get distilled or RO.
Drew, final word. West Coast IPAs. What's your best tip?
Don't overthink it and don't get intimidated.
I like that, guys. Well, thank you so much for taking time to do this. I thoroughly enjoyed what you had at Homebrew Conn. That was so well done. And I couldn't wait to actually get us to have a chance to talk about it one more time. Now, for everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun. And I want to hear your thoughts on West Coast IPAs. Put them right down here in the comments below. And also check out these videos that we selected just for you. So, guys, so appreciate it. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. Those guys were just a blast. I was laughing the whole time. So I would love to hear your ideas right down here in the comments, what you think about West Coast IPAs, in particular, what you think are the best widely distributed ones. So, and if you like the content, seriously, give me a like, give me a comment. All those are greatly appreciated. That's how I grow the channel and attract people like Denny and Drew. And I've got one coming up. May have seen, I did a little bit with Charlie Papazian. And I was at Sierra Nevada this past weekend at their exclusive Alpha Hops Society and had an interview with Terrence Sullivan. So some really cool stuff coming up. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great evening. Cheers.